I grew up believing that my mother was crazy. That's what my father said, so it had to be so. I don't think he ever actually used the word crazy, but that's what all of his stories meant. I didn't know any better, so I believed him. Mostly. I thought there must be something wrong with her because she would get along with my father if she weren't crazy, right? I grew up believing that my father's word was the truth about everything. Worshipping him was the family religion. His word was divine. No dissent was allowed. To question him was a sin. And he assured me in so many words that my mother was crazy. Everything was simple back then. He was light, she was dark. He was sane, she was crazy. He was good, she was bad. He constantly told me stories to reinforce that. Today, I see things very differently. But the basic narrative of my childhood was firmly established one Sunday afternoon when I was 5 years old. I vividly remember the facts of that day in sharp, clear detail. But I don't remember feeling anything. My lack of any emotion might be the most noteworthy thing about the day that my mother tried to kill my father. The day was just like any other Sunday afternoon for my family. We had gone to church that morning and had dinner at home in our dining room. We lived on Holly Hill Drive in Atlanta. I can picture the house inside and out very clearly. I was 5. My sisters were 3 and 1. Sunday dinner was finished. My father went to lie down on the living room sofa to read the Sunday paper. Mother was in the kitchen cleaning up the dishes. All of this was perfectly normal for us. I was standing in the open entryway at the edge of the living room, just at the place where that room met the hall. The dining room was between the kitchen and the living room on one side. The hall next to which I was standing was another way to the kitchen. Without warning, my mother came running through the dining room from the kitchen. She had a knife raised in her hand as she ran. I cried out, and my father looked up in time to reach out and grab her arm as she tried to stab him. I recognized the knife Mother had in her hand. It was from a rack of knives that hung on the kitchen wall. As my mother and father struggled over the knife in the living room, I ran down the hall to the kitchen. The knife rack hung on nails on a kitchen wall, and I reached up as high as I could to pull it off the wall. My little brain reasoned that if the first knife were to be wrestled away, there would always be more for her to get there. As I ran down the hall with the knife rack toward my bedroom, which was at the far end of the hall, I barely looked back into the living room. They were still struggling, and there was a lot of shouting, but I have no idea what was said. I just knew that I had to hide the rest of the knives. That's all that mattered to me. When I got back to my room, I shoved the knife rack under the bed. That's a great place to hide it, isn't it? I guess any other 5-year-old might think so too. The yelling from the living room slowly dissipated, but I still had no idea what was going on. I quietly left my room to find my 3-year-old sister, Rebecca. I don't recall where 1-year-old Mary was, but she was so young that she wasn't even involved. I told Rebecca that she had to come to my room to help guard the knives. After what seemed like a very long time to us, the house was silent. I didn't know what we should do, but I was still afraid to leave the knives. Eventually, I told Rebecca to stay and guard the knives while I ventured out to see what was going on. I found my parents sitting calmly on their bed. They were just talking. When I entered the room, my father instructed me to go get my sister. I remember thinking that it was probably safe to leave the knives for now because everything seemed calm and safe. Rebecca and I returned to their bedroom. My father proceeded to explain to us that adults sometimes play in this way, and that was all this was. I will never forget standing there silently as I listened to that explanation. "Do you think I'm stupid?" I thought with disgust. I remember those words very clearly in my head. I was upset that he thought I might believe such a lame explanation. Shortly after that day, my mother went to a mental hospital. My recollection is that she was there for about 6 weeks, but I do know for sure that however long it was, she had shock treatments while she was there. Throughout my childhood, this incident was marked as the time when my mother had a mental breakdown. As an adult, I've learned to see it very differently. My mother later told me, many years later, after I was grown and had tried to establish a relationship with her, that she knew my father was not ever going to let her leave. She said that she knew she would either kill him and end up in prison, or else she would kill herself. She had tried to leave him a couple of times already. The first time, my father came to Birmingham and found us staying at her brother's house and took us back to Atlanta. The second time, she moved us into some kind of apartment so that he wouldn't know where we were, but he bribed a clerk at the Birmingham Waterworks Board into telling him where she had opened an account, the address. He later would tell that story over and over with pride, believing that it demonstrated his commitment to his children. I never saw another incident of similar violence in my home. There was no hitting. They didn't throw things at each other. There was a bit of shoving a couple of times. Well, maybe more than a couple of times. He broke some things. But she did try to kill him that day. And she did it because she hoped to escape from him. She hoped to escape something that I didn't understand. She told me later that she was afraid it was her only way to ever get away from him without losing her life. When I went through that incident, nothing about my reaction seemed unusual to me. From this point in my life, though, everything about the way I acted seems unusual. I now think that a typical 5-year-old would have frozen in horror to watch what I watched. I have trouble believing that a typical 5-year-old putting aside his feelings and, could have been able to put aside his feelings and run to get the knife rack. I now think that my reactions were a weird blend. I was smart enough and composed enough to grab the knives, which I saw as the next level threat, but I was immature enough to think that a 3-year-old and I could protect them. I was immature enough to think that nobody could possibly look under my bed to find them. But as I said, I felt nothing. I was coldly rational, and I had no idea that that was unusual. I now think that a typical 5-year-old would have been a bit more willing to buy my father's lame explanation of what happened. Maybe, maybe not. I just now look back on my entire childhood and realize that I sensed something about the emotional horrors in which I lived. And I knew to keep my mouth shut about what I was coming to understand. I now think that a typical 5-year-old would have had a strong emotional reaction, both during the incident and afterward. But I repressed all of my feelings. I just felt as though I had to be wary. I had to keep my guard up and do my job of keeping my sisters safe. And by the way, this is one of the first times that it had ever occurred to me that I needed to protect them. This story has created a lot of shame for me over the years because I didn't like to see my family as the sort in which attempted violence could happen. We were a nice upper middle class family, not some ruffians who fought and stabbed one another. I've had to go through several stages of reinterpreting this because I've had a great need to explain it away or to excuse it. I had enough shame and pride that I wanted to feel that we were above something like this. My mother was away from us more than she was with us over the next 4 years. She basically lived away from us after she got out of the hospital. It was a difficult period, full of temporary reunions and sudden departures on her part. There was a lot of shouting and a lot of anger. We walked on eggshells at home. Then when I was 9, they divorced for good, and my father got full custody of the 3 children. In a very real way, I've never come to terms with what happened that day when I was 5. I think it changed me. I think it ended the innocence of childhood for me. Nothing was the same for me after that day. But nothing was the same for my mother either. Her time in a mental hospital was difficult. She was subjected to shock treatments, which messed with her mind. She lost some of her memories. She forgot, for instance, that her father was dead, so she had to relive the trauma of his death after she got out of the hospital. And why was she having these treatments to start with? It all went back to her attack on my father. I can remember her telling me years later that she tried to talk with the doctors about her frustrations with my father, about what had created the situation in the house, about the anguish that led to her breakdown. But nobody was really interested in hearing that. They were interested only in finding a medical explanation for her action. She had to be sick, in their minds, because she wouldn't have snapped otherwise. Mother soon learned to quit telling doctors about her frustrations with my father because her psychiatrists were not interested. The fact that they were all male in a profession which still saw women as quite inferior at the time surely played a role in that, but I would never be able to prove it. From that point on, Mother was just trying to find a way to get away from my father without losing her children. She spent the next 4 or 5 years moving in and out of our lives, as I said. If my parents had had no children, I'm confident that she would have cut him off completely and been done with him. But because he had documentation that she was sick, he held that over her. If she didn't comply with what he wanted, he would take the children and she would have no say. In the end, that's what happened anyway. I now understand that my father's issues with narcissistic personality disorder were at the root of the way he treated her and the way he treated us. I had no way to understand that at the time. My mother saw what he was because his dominant personality crushed her, but she didn't have the diagnostic language to explain that to anybody. So nobody listened to her. Nobody believed her. There was one exception to that. My youngest sister was closer to Mother and saw through the illness of our father far earlier than my other sister and I did. She and I have had strong differences since then, but I do have to give her credit for seeing the truth about our father long before the rest of us did, including me. I eventually concluded that my mother would have lived a perfectly normal life if she had never married my father. She would have been a brilliant and loving and creative woman who taught school and mothered the children in her elementary school classes. She would have always marched to the beat of a different drummer. She would have always been willing to stand apart from the crowd. She would have always been willing to be messy and disorganized, which she was, and she wouldn't have felt any need to apologize for it. My mother wasn't crazy. She didn't need the drugs that the psychiatrists gave her and which she became dependent on. My father crushed her spirit. He tried desperately to force her to be like him. She even tried to become what he wanted, but she simply couldn't do that because she wasn't like him. She couldn't obey and live his cookie-cutter life. So he crushed her with his efforts to mold her. And then the doctors did the rest by not listening to her. My mother wasn't crazy. I just wish that someone had taken her abuse at the hands of my father seriously when I was a little boy.